Grab your favorite beverage. It's time for the Beers and Bruisers Fantasy Football Podcast.
Fantasy freaks and geeks, what is up? It is week 16. This is part 1.5 of the Beers and Bruisers Fantasy Football Podcast. We're going to get into the 6 NFC home games, not including the Saturday games. I did a little mini episode last night of just the 3 Saturday games. This episode is going to be the rest of the NFC games, including a lot of division games, which are always fun, including the Monday night game between the Packers and the Vikings. So let's get started. We got 2 AFC teams visiting NFC teams this week. The Chiefs at the Bears. Mahomes, Kelsey, and Hill are obvious starts. It's the Chiefs running backs that have me and I'm sure a bunch of other fantasy owners very much concerned. LaShawn McCoy last week with under 3 yards per carry on only 6 carries, and he did not see a single target. Spencer Ware had more touches than LaShawn McCoy. I'm not playing him or Spencer Ware. Honestly, I don't think I'm going to play any of these Chiefs running backs right now, which is a shame because Andy Reid running backs have always been great in fantasy football. So I think when it comes to the Chiefs, it's really just Mahomes, Hill, and Kelsey. Looking at the Bears, Mitch Trubisky had another 300-plus passing yards game last week. Since his 3-game stretch of under 200 passing yards from week 9 to 11, he's averaged 298 passing yards a game over the last 4 games. He's been playing a lot better. I'm not saying go out and play Mitch Trubisky in your championship game, but because he's got 10 interceptions this year, I'm not going to trust that guy. But in his last 4 games, he's given me enough confidence to play the Bears wide receivers and feel good about it. Allen Robinson and Anthony Miller, they saw 29 targets between the 2 of them last week. Each had over 115 yards receiving. Both have averaged double-digit targets over those 4 games. The Chiefs do allow the 4th fewest fantasy points to wide receivers, but they are so much better at home than they are on the road. This game is in Chicago. Looking back at some of the wide receivers that they've played on the road. So in Jacksonville, DJ Shark had 146 yards and a touchdown in week 1. Against the Raiders in Oakland, Tyrell Williams had a touchdown. Week 4, Kenny Golladay had 2 touchdowns in Detroit. Week 7 in Denver, Cortland Sutton had 87 yards. Week 10 in Tennessee, Adam Humphries scored a touchdown. Week 11, the Chargers wide receivers, Keenan Allen, 71 yards and a touchdown. Mike Williams, 74 yards. And then week 14, Julian Edelman had 95 yards and a touchdown in New England there. So they have given up some fantasy numbers to wide receivers on the road, and because of that, I think Allen Robinson and Anthony Miller, along with Mitchell Trubisky's increase in his production lately, I think you can play both of those Bear wide receivers and feel pretty good about it. I don't know what to do with David Montgomery. He's got a great matchup against the Chiefs. They allow the 5th most fantasy points to running backs. But he had a great matchup last week as well, and he only had 2.8 yards per carry on 14 carries. However, Tariq Cohen, he was the much better play last week, and I think he's going to be a better play this week. 12 fantasy points last week, 8 carries and 7 catches on 10 targets. The Chiefs also allow the 4th most receptions and the most receiving yards to running backs. So if Cohen sees 20% of the targets again, he's going to be huge. He's going to be in my FanDuel lineup for sure. Moving on to the next AFC team visiting an NFC team. We got the Jaguars at the Falcons. Both of these teams coming off of a win last week. For the Jaguars, Chris Conley's 2nd touchdown last week really cost me in a FanDuel contest. I just started a new job, and at work we have a little mini FanDuel contest, and I was winning all day long. until Chris Conley and the 20 seconds left on the clock when he scored. It was pretty beat for me, but that's the way it goes. DJ Shark out for last week's game. Chris Conley stepped in and played really nice. I thought it was going to be D.D. Westbrook's game, but he finished 4th in targets and 5th in receiving yards. Conley led the team with 8 targets, 3 in the red zone, 2 converted for touchdowns, like I said. And Keenan Cole led the team in receiving yards. He had 55 of his 76 yards on 1 catch, though. So, but he also had 2 red zone targets himself. So I don't know what to make of this wide receiver group, which is why I'm kind of staying away. Also, the Falcons have played better against wide receivers as of late. Since their Week 10 bye, Leonard Fournette is averaging only 15 carries a game. The Jags just don't get it, man. I don't understand. I know he's very involved in the pass game, which is great, 6 to 7 targets a game, but I just don't get why they don't feed this dude. He's huge, just let him friggin' run over dudes. But maybe it's his durability. He has had, some random injuries here, ankle, hip, whatever. And I don't know, but Falcons are a middle-of-the-pack run defense, so should be a good opportunity for Fournette to have a good game. I have him in a non-PPR league, and I'm playing him in my championship. So, looking at the Falcons last week, Julio had 20 targets versus the 49ers in their big upset win. I was curious how the Falcons would split up the targets left behind by Calvin Ridley, and the answer, I guess, is just give them all to Julio. This week versus the Jags that have given up the 6th most receiving yards and the 2nd most fantasy points to running backs. I think we're going to see the Falcons try and run the ball more. Only 15 rushing attempts last week. 2 weeks ago versus the Panthers, the only team worst against running backs than the Jaguars this season. Freeman had 21 touches. And in I think it was week 5 or week 6 when Freeman was hurt, the Falcons running backs saw 23 touches. So the Jags are also really bad at defending tight ends. Only 3 teams have allowed more touchdowns to tight ends than the Jaguars. They just gave up 8 catches and 122 yards to Darren Waller. So I'm expecting Austin Hooper to be heavily involved in this game as well. He's another one of the guys in my FanDuel lineup this week. All right, let's get into these division games. We got the Cardinals at the Seahawks, a little NFC West showdown. The Cardinals' backfield is a mystery to me. I don't know how David Johnson fell so far from grace so fast, but it is glaringly obvious that this is Kenyon Drake's backfield. Last week, 22 carries, 137 yards, and 4 touchdowns. He looked awesome. Last time Arizona played Seattle, the Cardinals had over 100 team rushing yards, with 40 of them coming from David Johnson, 35 yards from Chase Edmonds, and 30 plus a touchdown from Kyler Murray. So the Cardinals, they ran the ball 17 times with their running backs that day, and they actually targeted David Johnson 11 times in that game, more than Christian Kirk and Larry Fitzgerald combined. So I wish I could say I'd expect a big game for David Johnson and to see a similar workload that he saw in that game, but that was 3 months ago. This Cardinals team has changed since then. I think we see Drake get a big workload again. If they can keep it close with the Seahawks, after last week's 4-touchdown game, the Cardinals would be nuts not to give Kenyon Drake the ball. I'm particularly nervous about Kenyon Drake this week because I had him in a league that I dropped him a few weeks ago, and now in my fantasy championship, in one of my championships, the dude that I'm playing has Drake. He added him. And I'm sure it's going to be my luck that I'm going to lose because I dropped Kenyon Drake. I can't trust Christian Kirk or Larry Fitzgerald this week, not after seeing them get fewer targets than Demir Bird, if that's how you say his name. It's that the whole offense is a mystery to me. We'll have to see what Cliff Kingsbury can really do once they actually build an offensive line for Kyler Murray. Looking at the Seahawks, the Cardinals allow the 4th most receptions, the 5th most receiving yards, and the 10th most fantasy points to running back. So it's a great week to own Chris Carson with his 133 yards and 2 touchdowns last week. Carson is going to win a lot of people their fantasy leagues, I think. I said last week to play Tyler Lockett. He would have a great game, and he did because he always does when Seattle is able to run the ball like they did last week. He had 8 catches on 9 targets for 120 yards and a touchdown. With Josh Gordon getting suspended again, it seems like a few extra targets are going to be going to Lockett and Metcalf, which is a good thing. Jacob Hollister is the lucky man this week with the tight end matchup against the Cardinals. He will be on my anytime touchdown scorer parlay ticket for sure. Those Cardinals are just not very good at defending tight ends. All right, NFC East. We got the Giants at the Redskins. The Giants put up more points last week than they did in any other game this year, despite Eli throwing 3 interceptions. They rode Saquon to victory, 24 carries for 112 yards and 2 touchdowns. He's a great start playing the Redskins this week, who allowed the 8th most receptions and fantasy points to running backs, so he should be awesome again. Golden Tate and Darius Slayton both caught long touchdowns. Slayton now with 3 touchdowns in the last 2 games. And Sterling Shepard with his first 100-yard game since Week 3, first double-digit target game all year. Unless Evan Ingram returns, I expect the offense to look very similar this week. Ingram would mess things up if he were to return. He was looking like he was close the past 2 weeks, but the Giants decided against playing him. He'd step into the 5th best matchup for tight ends this week. He caught 4 passes on 7 targets for 54 yards in Week 4 when they played in New York. Looking at the Redskins, Terry McLaurin now with back-to-back games with a touchdown, caught all 5 of his targets last week for 130 yards, and he had a 75-yard touchdown catch. Maybe this connection, between Terry McLaurin and Dwayne Haskins is finally starting to kick in. He's a start versus this 29th ranked pass defense of the New York Football Giants, who last week gave up 2 touchdowns and 72 yards to Devontae Parker. And they've been torched by wide receivers all year. So Terry McLaurin, a start for sure. Giants' run defense has gotten better since acquiring Leonard Williams from my Jets. And they play much better on the road than they do at home. They allow 40 less rushing yards per game on the road. I know Adrian Peterson has scored in 3 straight games, and he's averaging about 16 carries over those 3, but I'm going to avoid Peterson in my championship. I just can't roll with him as my running back. All right, another NFC East matchup. We got the Cowboys and the Eagles. I'm particularly excited about this game. It's pretty much is going to decide who the NFC East champion is. The Cowboys put up 44 points last week, no thanks to their wide receivers, who only saw 7 targets between the 3 of them. Cooper, Gallup, and Cobb each only caught 1 pass, but the Cowboys and Ezekiel Elliott just dominated with the run game. I think this week we completely see the opposite. The Eagles allow the 7th fewest fantasy points to running backs while allowing the 3rd most to wide receivers. So I expect the Cowboys to try and get the ball to their wide receivers a little bit more in this game. More than they did in Week 7 when they played, and Dak only threw the ball 27 times. Zeke still had 22 carries and over 100 yards with a touchdown that game. I'm really hoping to see a similar stat line. I got Zeke in 2 championship matchups. Amari also had 100 yards in that game. So, it's probably going to be a big 3. I would expect them to stick with Zeke, and I think Amari's going to get more involved, and I think he should play much better against this Eagles pass defense. It's not very good. The Eagles wide receiver group is almost as unhealthy as the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. They're left with just Greg Ward as the only wide receiver option, with the only reliable wide receiver option, with J.J. Arcega-Whiteside failing to catch either of his 2 targets last week. He had the 2nd most air yards and targets on the team last week, that being Greg Ward. And he caught his first touchdown on a goal line target with 32 seconds left to win the game. So he's obviously earned the trust of the coaches and, to me, more importantly, Carson Wentz. Greg Ward should be the best value in FanDuel this week. He's got to be one of the cheaper wide receivers, and he's going to see volume. After seeing what Tyler Higbee was able to do versus Dallas last week, 12 catches on 14 targets for 111 yards, and with the Eagles' pass game being what it is right now, you got to figure that the Eagles' tight ends are also going to eat. Definitely Zach Ertz, 10 targets last week, led the team. So, like I said, I'm excited about this game. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. And to our last game here for part 1.5 of the Week 16 Beers and Bruisers Fantasy Football Podcast. We got the Packers at the Vikings, both teams coming off of a win. The Packers are pretty easy here. You should start Davante Adams, and you should start Aaron Jones. And to me, that's pretty much it. Jamal Williams played pretty well the last time that they played the Vikings, but so did Aaron Jones. Yes, the Vikings allowed the 9th fewest fantasy points to running backs, but check out what Aaron Jones did versus the Vikings in Week 2. He had 23 carries for 116 yards and a touchdown, plus caught 4 of his 6 targets for 34 yards. It's a nice little boost in his production there. 23 fantasy points that day. He's been on fire over the last 2 games, 2 touchdowns last week and just under 200 total yards the week before that. Davante Adams with his first 100-yard game since Week 10. He's also played great versus Minnesota in Week 2, 106 yards on 7 catches. The Vikings ranked 10th in most fantasy points allowed to wide receivers. So I think it's a big 3. I think it's Rodgers, Davante Adams, and Aaron Jones for the Packers. Looking at the Vikings, the big deal for the Vikings this week is the running back situation. So Dalvin Cook left the game early after only 12 touches for the second time in the last 3 games. And with Alexander Mattison out with an ankle injury last week, Mike Boone scored twice. He had 13 carries, which looks nice, but 10 of them were in the fourth quarter, including both of his touchdowns. They were already up, I think, 25-10 or something like that going into the fourth quarter. So to me, it was mostly just a garbage time thing. If he's the sole running back, I don't think he's going to see 20-something touches. I think it would be more like 13 to 15. I have all 3 of these guys in a PPR championship matchup. I drafted Cook. I added Alexander Mattison mid-season, and I added Mike Boone last week. This is one of the most productive run games in the NFL. If Cook is active, I don't care if all 3 of them play. If Cook is active, I'm playing Dalvin Cook. If not, and if we're left with just Mattison and Boone, I think I'm going to go more towards Mattison. And if Mattison and Cook are both out, then I think it's obviously going to be Mike Boone. If Cook is out and both the other 2 are active, like I said, I think Mattison is the guy that will probably see more touches as long as he can stay healthy. He's got a little ankle injury that's continued to keep him out, so it's definitely concerning. I'm nervous about it, but I got all 3 of them, so Sunday morning I'll have to just make the best decision I can. And plus, the Packers, they allow the 7th most receptions and the 7th most fantasy points to running backs, so whichever one of these guys does see the majority of the carries, they should be pretty good. Hopefully, the Vikings can keep this game close. Hopefully, they don't just decide, hey, with the running back situation being what it is, let's just have Kirk Cousins throw the ball 35, 40 times. That would really suck, but it is what it is. That's fantasy football, and this is why you handcuff your top running backs, especially going into the playoffs. Alexander Mattison could absolutely win you a league if he starts and Dalvin Cook doesn't, and so can Mike Boone. If he's the only guy that's healthy out of these 3 running backs, he should be great. So that's going to do it. Thanks for tuning in. Make sure you check out the AFC home games. There's, I think, 7 of those, and we're going to record those tomorrow morning. So, again, thanks. And as always, may the fantasy gods be cruel to your opponents.
You have been listening to the Beers and Bruisers Fantasy Football Podcast. For more episodes and information, follow us on social media and tune in every week. Beers and Bruisers is available on Google Podcasts, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Alexa, Reach TV, or your favorite podcast service. Beers and Bruisers is a proud member of the HC Universal Network family of podcasts. To find out more about this and other great shows on our network, visit us online at hcuniversalnetwork.com or download the free HC Universal Network app today. Fantasy football is fun, but gambling addiction destroys lives. If you or someone you love suffers from gambling addiction, please do not be afraid to seek help. The National Council on Problem Gaming operates a national problem gambling helpline network. Contact them today at 1-800-522-4700. Thank you for tuning in to the Beers and Bruisers Fantasy Football Podcast. Please remember to drink responsibly and always look for your man downfield.